Hi, my name is Dr. Rae Banigan, and I'm a speech and language pathologist, and I specialize in working with families with children under 3 years of age. One of the most exciting experiences a parent can have is when their child says mama or dada for the first time, or when they say their first words. Children learn to talk naturally. They don't need to be taught how to say words or how to learn to listen. They do it naturally from the time that they're born. But they do need to have a caring communication partner who is going to help them explore the world and share information about the world and the words that we use to describe that. The purpose of this program is to share information with you about how children develop communication and some of the risk factors to look at to see if your child is having difficulty, as well as sharing some strategies with you as a parent to help to find ways that you can help your child how to develop communication. Children have very unique styles of learning to communicate. Children are very different. There are basically two general types of children. You have the children who are what I call the manipulators, and meaning their approach to learning is they've got to do it. They're generally more active children. They try to explore. They need to find out things. And their whole focus of learning is doing. The other type of general approach to learning are the social children. Those are the children who are most interested in talking about what they're doing and sharing it with you or another person. Now, children can't change their style. They are born with the style. But you as adults can change yours to fit your child's style. And in fact, it helps children learn to communicate more effectively if your style of communication and exploring matches your child's style of learning. Now, one of the issues that affect a child's ability to learn to communicate are health issues. Obviously, you know, if you don't feel well, you're not really interested in talking about stuff. You just kind of want to lay down and cuddle. And children are that way too. When they don't feel well, they don't want to explore, and they're not as interested in listening to what you have to say or talking with you. So when a child is not feeling well, it's not an optimum time for learning to communicate. So health issues obviously are important to a child in learning to communicate. But one of the health issues that is most prevalent in young children has to do with fluid in the middle ear. It's the most prevalent difficulty that young children have in health, and sometimes children get ear infections, but sometimes they can also have fluid in their ears because of allergies or because they have upper respiratory infections, so that they may have fluid without having an ear infection. Doctors, obviously, and you as parents are concerned about the ear infection because your child screams, they run a temperature, and it's physically very uncomfortable for the child. But those times, obviously, you take your child to your child's physician. There are other times, though, that once the child gets on an antibiotic, they still have fluid in their ear for up to 3 months after they may have had an ear infection. It is that fluid in the middle ear that affects the child's ability to communicate. And a way to think about it is like when you have a cold and your ears kind of feel blocked up, you find yourself watching what everybody says or turning the volume up on the TV, because your brain is able to fill in what you're not hearing because your ears are kind of plugged up. A child can't fill in because they don't know the language or communication yet. So what happens to them is that what they hear is different. Every time that you say a word, it sounds different for them, and it makes it very difficult for them to represent communication. The effect that this can have is very different. There are some children who have ear infections or difficulty with fluid, and it has no effect on their communication development. They develop communication fine without any problems. There are other children where it significantly affects their ability to talk. Their understanding is fine, but they don't get enough information to be able to translate the words that they hear into the motor movements to say the word. So their understanding may be fine, but they don't talk. And there are certain characteristics that you want to look for in your own child to see if, in fact, the fluid that your child may have in their middle ear is affecting their ability to communicate. The first characteristic is that children either point or grunt or gesture instead of using words. Now again, this depends upon the child's style of communication. If your child is the manipulator kind of child who is into doing stuff, they're not going to talk at all. They will say very little. In fact, they will say almost nothing. When they play, they don't make any sounds. They just, because of their interest in the play, they're not going to be saying very much. They may not do any pointing or even gesturing. They tend to close off the outside world and the communication that they hear because it just doesn't quite make sense to them. The social children, on the other hand, will, because of their interest in talking, they will go and use vowel sounds. They'll grunt. They'll try to communicate, but not without having any words. So those are the children who will be making lots of sounds, primarily vowel sounds, but not using words either. The second characteristic is that children who have fluctuating fluid difficulties have difficulty representing consonant sounds. The vowel sounds are a little easier to hear. And also, when you have fluid in the middle ear, it generally affects the higher frequencies before it affects the lower frequencies, which are vowels. So the child hears the vowels. So like if you say cat, the child kind of hears ah. Okay, so when you say ah and this soft, fluffy thing walks by, the child says, oh, cat. So he gets the understanding of what cat is, but he doesn't have that information of the k and the t that he needs in order to say the word cat. If he's going to say it, it's going to come out ah. So children who have difficulty with fluid tend to have many fewer consonants in what they say. They tend to use vowels primarily. They also consistently tend to leave off parts of words, primarily the end of a word. So if they were going to say man, they'd say meh. Now, I have found a few children who leave off the front part of the word, but that's not usual, where they would say an instead of man. That's not the most typical kind of omissions. Usually the child tends to either just say the vowel or they say the first consonant, which is a little easier for them to pick up in the word, and leave off the end. These children who are having difficulty because of that fluid also tend to produce fewer words. In a few minutes, I'll be telling you about how children develop words and what to look for relative to numbers of words during the first 3 years that you'll see. But children who have difficulty with fluid tend to produce many fewer words. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is they need the sounds to be able to produce the word, and if they don't have the sounds, they can't produce the words. And the other is that they don't, because they just don't have enough information, they can't send the messages to their mouth to show their mouth how to make the word. So generally they tend to produce fewer words than other children who don't have difficulties with fluid. The last characteristic is that the children tend to use fewer words, meaning they won't talk as much while they're playing. They may play very quietly. They may be more independent to go and get everything and do everything themselves versus asking for that. They may not comment about what they're doing, like you may be sitting in the same room as the child and the child will pick something up and may not tell you what it is or ask you for what it is. They don't use communication as much in their play and interaction with you. Often parents who have had children with difficulty that I've worked with, they're very surprised because you get used to the way that your child communicates and plays and interacts, and that appears normal to you. But all of a sudden when your child starts talking and starts talking about everything that they're doing, it seems really different to you. But that is what a child normally would do if they didn't have difficulty with fluid. As children get older, they also tend to collapse the syllables, which are the parts of a word, where they will have gotten part of the word, but not the whole word, so that they'll say animal as amma. They'll kind of leave out parts of the word. Now, children, again, there's always that if side of this. Children do tend to simplify longer words because they have limited abilities to make the motor movements, and that ability starts from birth and develops throughout their childhood. So it's not unusual to have the Pischetti for spaghetti, where children will kind of collapse things and say words differently. But with children who have fluid difficulties, there's a real consistent pattern of simplifying words because they just can't quite get the whole word. Now, these early difficulties that children demonstrate related to fluid in their ears often can affect them much later on. It can affect their ability to learn to read, and it can affect their ability to function in school and be successful academically. And the most recent studies that we've done have shown that there is a connection. For a long time, we didn't feel that there was a connection between children's learning disabilities or other difficulties like attention deficit disorder. Some of the disorders that children demonstrate as they develop in school and have difficulties learning in school, we are finding many more children, as we look back, have had difficulties with fluid in their ears. And there appears to be, the research is relatively new, but we are finding more of a link between the earlier, in the first 3 years of life, this difficulty with fluid, and the later learning in academics. And several of the specific types of difficulties that children have are related to, again, that inconsistency in what they hear. You may say the word lots of times to them, but because of that fluctuation in fluid, they don't hear it the same. And of course, because of this later difficulty that children may have because of that earlier fluid, early identification or prevention, if possible, are absolutely critical. Meaning, if there are things, the research that I've done in the last 15 years has basically been focusing on how can parents say words to help these children who have this fluctuation in fluid develop communication normally. And I'll be sharing, as we talk in this program, I'll be sharing some of those strategies with you. So that is an approach to prevention. Well, obviously, you want the medical approach to prevention, doing whatever you can to keep your child healthy, but unfortunately, that is not always possible with young children. They're susceptible to a lot of viral infections, and of course, when they're also a member of the family, everybody in the family gets it. It kind of gets passed down for the youngest child. But our approach to prevention, and one of the reasons that I'm doing this program, is by sharing information with you about ways that you can, for example, say words. For example, one thing that you can do is target when a child seems to be stuffed up. You can increase your volume when you say words. You can repeat a word more frequently. You can target in on those consonant sounds. So in our word man, you could say man, where in fact I kind of targeted that M so that kind of stood out for the child. And some of these strategies can help prevent a child from having difficulties even when they still have fluid. And that, of course, is our goal. The early identification is also critical because you as a parent know your child, but I as a professional know how children develop communication and strategies that you can use. So that team, once a child is identified as needing help, that team approach between you as the parent and me as the speech and language pathologist can help us work together to find what strategies work for your child, where in fact the earlier that we identify what a child needs, there is a much better chance that that child will develop normally later on. And at this point, we're looking at close to 70% of the children that I've been researching. If we get the children early, and when I mean early, generally before around 12 to 18 months is the earliest that, well, we like them early. There are some children I've identified as early as 4 months of age. But the earlier the better. But generally, as long as we can get them generally about 18 months of age, that's the optimum time to let us work with the natural system of development that I'm going to talk to you about and help find those strategies that can help compensate for that fluctuation in fluid in the children. Now, some of these later characteristics that we have found are related to this fluctuation in fluid is, number one, sound representation. Children may have difficulty in producing sounds because, again, they didn't hear them when you said them. They also have difficulty in what we call discrimination, and that's telling the differences between sounds. For example, a b and a p, or the s and sh sounds. You have to hear that slight difference between those sounds, and that's called discrimination. Now, we tell the difference between sounds by themselves, but also in words, like the difference between pat and cat, or pat and bat. Our ears have to figure out that, yeah, the AT, that at is the same, but that first sound is different, and that's what discrimination is. Now, another component that is really critical to a child's ability to read is called segmentation, and that is our ability to break a word up into sounds. For example, if I say the word cat, normally a child just kind of processes that whole word together when they first start learning words. But later they start to realize that that word cat is made up of a k, a, and a t. And that's called segmentation. And a child who is going to try to learn to read generally needs to be able to do that because they're going to see the word C-A-T, and in order to read that word, they're going to have to put the k, at to figure out what that word is, to realize that that word is cat. Children also have difficulties in sequencing sounds, sequencing abilities, where a child, because they kind of process that whole word versus the individual sounds, words like stop may be difficult for them because they have to get the ST and the OP in the right order in order for it to have the correct word. Also, patterning of sounds is often difficult for children. Like if I say bat, cat, fat, sat. Now you're listening to me and all of a sudden say, oh yeah, they all have that at the end. That's called patterning. Our brains kind of pick up, yeah, that ending is all the same. And then we just kind of fill in the first part of the word to see where the difference is. And that's patterning, and that becomes very critical to children when they're learning to read. And you can hear when you see children in their beginning readers, you know, the bat sat on the cat, you know, where they only have to remember 3 new sounds and can remember that pattern. So patterning can be difficult as a later characteristic of children who have had early fluid. Children also have difficulties in what we call phonetic encoding, which is where we take that sound that they have represented in their head, that b, and we add the letter B. And that's called phonetic encoding. And obviously, if the child has a sound in their head that's different than your sound for the B, they're going to have difficulty encoding this letter. Sometimes children, if they say the sound incorrectly, they may read it incorrectly, meaning if they say th for the sound later on, which is a normal articulation pattern that you'll see in children until they stabilize their sound production, they may read it, the word, incorrectly. So that component of phonetic encoding is dependent upon what the child has represented in their head. Now, another characteristic that can be affected later on in children is what we call synthesizing sounds, or putting sounds together to form words. for example, if you want to spell a word, you have to be able to segment, break that word apart, but then you also have to be able to put it together so that when you hear cat, you know that it is the word cat. You have to put those sounds together. So to be able to read and spell and write, you have to be able to break words apart and put them back together. Now, another characteristic that children may demonstrate difficulty in is remembering things that are unrelated. And when children have difficulty with fluctuating fluid early on, it seems to affect how they process information. We all, when somebody says something to us, we just kind of scan quickly for meaning. Okay, that's our first step. Then we kind of go back and decide, well, where we put the words and whether, are we going to save this information or are we going to just get rid of it? If someone says, "Good morning, how are you doing today?" Well, you respond to them, you understood what they said, but that's obviously not something you're going to keep in your brain. Our brains would be overloaded very quickly if we kept everything that everyone said. So we're constantly making decisions about what do we keep and what do we get rid of. And to do that, we have kind of a holding tank. It's called a short-term memory, where we kind of hold the things that we hear, and then when we decide, well, if we want to put it in this long-term storage so we'd have it again, or whether we want to get rid of it. Children who have fluctuating fluid often have difficulty in that holding tank, or the short-term memory, where because they are not sure of what they hear, they tend to kind of bypass that holding tank and or try to hold too much in it. So that later things like spelling can be very difficult for them because spelling depends very much on holding sequences of unrelated information. Also some math concepts. Math, for example, when you have the math tables, 2 + 2 = 4, and you memorize those kinds of things, that's another short-term memory type of task. And children with fluctuating fluids could have difficulty with those kinds of tasks later on. The last characteristic that we see later on in school from children who have had earlier difficulties in fluctuating fluid is in following directions. And it appears to be the reason that they have those difficulties is that they kind of tax their listening system. They're always working so hard to figure out the meaning that they don't always tune into, for example, the form of the language. Like, write your name in the upper right-hand corner of the page. Teachers say this all the time. Well, we have to look at the relationship between upper, right-hand, and corner to help us figure out where we have to write our name. And when children who have had fluctuating fluid override their normal system to process information, sometimes they lose those abilities, or they don't develop. They don't really lose them, I think. From most of the research that we have, it's not really lost. It's the fact that they don't develop those abilities to handle larger amounts of information very effectively. So as you can see, some of those early ear infections or fluid that your child may have can have a significant effect not only on their ability to learn to communicate from birth to 3 years of age, but also in later academics. The research that we've done, we haven't really defined clearly what the relationship between this fluid and the ability to communicate and learn is. But we have identified some risk factors that it's important for you as a parent to know, so that you can make decisions on, well, is my child developing normally or are they having some difficulties? The first characteristic of a risk factor is it is the earlier that a child has fluid, the highest risk they are for difficulties in developing communication and later difficulties. So if your child has fluctuations in fluid levels or ear infections within the first 3 to 6 months, that places them at the highest risk for having difficulties. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to have difficulties. When I say high risk, remember, as I said before, there are children who have had serious difficulties with ear infections and fluid, and that has had no effect on their communication development. We don't know why yet. Maybe in about 10 years I'll be able to tell you, but right now we don't know why. We're still researching that component, but at this point we have identified what those risk factors are so that families and physicians who are responsible in making decisions about children and managing fluid and ear infections can have some information in helping them make those decisions. It is the number of days that a child has fluid in their ear that, again, is one of the most important risk factors. So if yours is a child who has an ear infection and gets fluid, but a few weeks later they're back up, their hearing appears to be fine, and you go back for your follow-up by the doctor and the fluid's all gone, that child has less of a risk than the child who goes back to the doctor 2 weeks later and either they need another course of antibiotic because the infection wasn't cleared up, or they go back and they're fine, and within 2 weeks, because the fluid was still there, they have another ear infection, or they're constantly dealing with this fluid. It's the child who has the fluid the longer time that would be at the greatest risk for communication difficulties. And the most important thing to remember in looking at your child related to communication development and fluid is that it doesn't affect their ability to understand. A little later I'll talk about that difference in understanding versus production of language. They're very different processes in young children. For us, they're kind of the same as adults, but young children, those processes are very different. So if you have a child who understands everything but doesn't say anything, that would be a risk factor. The fact that there is such a huge difference between your child's ability to understand you and your child's ability to tell you what he or she is thinking. And also, one of the characteristics that I found that indicate the greatest risk for communication difficulties and also the later is that omission of consonant sounds. If children leave off the ends of words, that's one of the most important factors that I look at when I'm talking with a parent about their child's developing communication, because that tells me that they're either not hearing those sounds or motorically can't produce those sounds, but that tells me that they appear to be having more difficulty and that we want to try to do something to help them get those sounds. And again, those collapsing words is another risk factor that you as a parent would want to look at. Now, as we've looked at some of the medical factors, the health factors, the style factors, we now want to take a look at what normal communication is, how children develop communication normally over the course of their lives from birth to 3 years. Obviously, we continue developing communication after 3 years of age, but this program is just going to talk primarily on the birth to 3 years time frame. As adults, we continue to learn for a whole lifespan. For example, learning new words, we continue throughout our lifespan. The reason that birth to 3 years of age is so critical is the fact that it's mind-boggling, but children innately develop the rules that they will need to form every sentence that they will ever form in their lifespan before they're 3 years of age. Those rules, from just listening to us talk and talking with us and making decision about what those rules are, they develop their entire rule system that they will need for every sentence they'd ever want to produce by 3 years of age. I've been working with children for 30 years, and that still is mind-boggling to me. But it makes it even more critical for me as a speech and language pathologist who works with a child under 3 to make sure I get all that stuff in by the time they are 3. And for you as a parent to realize how critical those early years are. And also, there have been a lot of studies just recently, within the last year, where we have started to use MRIs and actually able to look at the brain and the development of the brain itself, to see that during that birth to 3 time is incredibly critical for children's learning, because during that time the brain develops millions of the connections that we will need for all our future learning. And if those connections aren't used by the time the child is 3, they lose them. Meaning if we take an MRI of a child's brain at 2 and then a child's brain at 5, if they haven't begun to develop those early connections, those connections are lost. So we have, as a society, as we're getting more and more information about the brain, are becoming more and more interested in what we can do in those first 3 years, because those first 3 years truly are the building blocks for all future learning, which is why I specialize in this age group, because I feel it's so critical for us to work with children at that age, not after they're 3, 4, or 5 years of age when they get into school. That's too late, because then they, and again in some of the studies that I've done with children, if we can identify children and work with the families and help to get the communication in normally, by 3 years of age, generally these children don't develop learning disabilities or reading disabilities or academic difficulties later. So that again is that prevention component of getting in there, getting the brain stimulated, finding a way. And again, often we can't change the fluctuation in fluid, or we can't change some of the physical difficulties that a child may have. But as parents, we can change the way we talk to a child relatively easily, and so that we can often make a difference in what that child can put into their brain. 2 important things we want to look at when we're looking about how children develop communication. The first one has to do with the range of normal. As I said, children have very unique styles of developing communication. Children who are the manipulator, I call, the one whose whole focus is on doing, well, those children tend to develop communication a little bit later. That's still normal for them, but in fact, they're going to develop communication a little bit later than the child who's the social child. And I've had parents describe to me, but you know, the child came out of the womb talking, that they just are talking all the time. It's that making the connection with the parent is what's important for learning for that child, versus the manipulated child. They love their parents and want to share, but their focus is come and play with me, you know, build this tower with me. We don't have to talk about it. So those children will develop communication a little bit later. And also, there is differences in children. Now, there are no differences, and nobody's going to believe me when I say this, there aren't any differences between boys and girls in developing communication. There has never been a research study, to my knowledge, and if any of you know of one, I want to hear about it. To my knowledge, there's never been a study that has shown that there is a difference between, just based on sex alone, between boys and girls. I have myself done studies for the last 20 years with children under 3 years of age, and have probably worked with, well, probably close to 2,000 children. So I have a pretty good sample myself. And I have seen that difference of style is the factor. Now, there may be, girls may be more social than boys may be, but it is that style. Because if you have a girl who's a manipulator, it doesn't matter whether she's a girl or a boy. It's her style. So there's a huge range of normal communication. And one example that I can give you from one of the studies that I did is I worked with 24-month-olds. And I worked with 75 of them. And one of the things that I did is I had the parent fill out a chart of every word that the child produced. So we looked at the number of words that children produced at 24 months. And that number ranged for the group that I worked with from 70 words to 487. Now, all of those children were developing communication normally. Obviously, our little child with the 487 was a social communicator. And probably the child that was, if I don't remember the child specifically, but the child who had the 70 was most likely that manipulator type of child who was very bright and very interested in building and doing things, but not so interested in the talking of them. So there's a huge range. And one of the things that's hard for physicians and for families to decide when their child's having difficulty is because there's this huge range of normal. For example, a child will develop their first words as early as 8 months or as late as 14 months, and those children are all fine. So when we're talking about normal development, I'm going to be giving you kind of the criteria that would make sure that the child has it by this age. If they don't have it by that age, then they may be having difficulties. So they may get it much earlier, but they should have that characteristic by that age. And that's, again, why it's more important to share with a professional, a speech and language pathologist, if you have a concern, because I do have the knowledge to say to you, well, okay, tell me about your child. And I can determine whether what you're saying to me represents that normal range or whether that child appears to be having difficulty. So that range, there's a huge range in normal development, and as you're looking at your children, you need to think of that range, because I'm sure every one of you who have more than one child have experienced this, because your children may be very different. And you know, you tend to want to judge, well, this child did this, why isn't that child? But because they're different, they're in that huge range. Now, another factor that is important in the range is sequence of child. First children tend to talk earlier and more than each subsequent child in a family. Now again, depending upon their style. So that if you have a child, your first child may have talked earlier than your second child. Now that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the second child's communication. It just may mean that the communication when there are more than one child in the family is different, because they get communication from their siblings as well as from you. And those interactions that they have with their siblings in learning also affects how they learn to communicate. So the research does show that there is a difference in family order relative to how quickly, but I have found that that tends to be a secondary factor to the child's style of communication. Now, the second factor that we need to look at in looking at normal development is that difference between listening and talking. And at each stage of development, I'm going to share with you what to expect from listening, from what a child listens to, and what their talking is, because there is that difference. And that difference comes from what is involved in talking versus what is involved in listening. In listening, you hear a word, and you listen to that word, and then you match in your brain, you kind of scan in your brain for what you've heard that word before, and you match it with a meaning. And now that's a relatively simple process. Where talking requires you to think of something, then scan through all of the information that you have in your brain to find the word for the thought that you want to say. You then have to not only pull that word, but you then have to take the information from your brain that translates how you say that word, the sounds and the motor movements to say that word. So as you see, that's a much more difficult process. So generally, children tend to get the understanding parts first, and then we'll get the production or the ability to say the word. For example, a child will understand what a dog is before they will say the word dog. So as we're looking at development, we're going to be looking both at what type of listening is pretty typical of a child in that age and what the talking is for a child of that age. And that will be somewhat different. The first age that we're going to look at is the age from birth to 12 months. And I identify this as a stage where a child is getting in touch with the world. We've done studies on looking at what children get within the womb, and in fact we know that they hear, and there's been a lot of fun studies such as playing music to see if when your child comes out they like the kind of music that you played. We're still working on what we know about the neonatal experience, but from birth to 12 months the child is really trying to make sense of all the sounds and everything that they see and feel. So it is getting in touch with the world. I'm going to show you a clip on a little child. His name is Matthew, and he's 6 months of age. And take a look at Matthew to get a sense of what a child is like in this age range before I talk about those characteristics. Okay, let's first look at the listening of what a child develops in listening during those first 12 months. First of all, the child has to focus on sound, and the child is born ready to listen to human speech. Within the first 24 hours, a child is able to focus more into speech sounds than any other sound. So they are born with the capacity to know what to listen to, that you listen to the human voice. So they focus in on that voice, but then they have to learn to understand, well, who's that voice? That voice belongs to mom, or that voice belongs to dad, or my brother or sister. So they listen to voice sounds, and they also listen to other sounds that they hear in their environment. And they have to become aware of what those sounds are, locate where those sounds are, and get a sense of whether those sounds have meaning or not. After they focus in on sound, they start to focus specifically in on speech. When people are saying words to them, they listen to those words and try to focus in on what those words mean. First, of course, they're just interested in the sound that you're making. Later, they become interested in the word that you are saying and what it means. And during this period of time, a child is focused in listening on finding the meaning. Because it's one thing to hear the word ball, but then you've got to kind of figure out what that word represents. Because words are meaningless unless we know what that word means. And the perfect example is in a foreign language. You can hear someone talking in a foreign language, and you may understand the sounds and understand everything that they're saying, but if you don't know what those words mean, you can't communicate with that person. You can still hear the sounds and the words and identify. You could tell that person what that word was. You can probably repeat it, but without knowing what that word represents, you cannot communicate with that person. So this first 12 months in listening, children focus on finding the meaning in words. First, they have to tune into what a word is. They hear lots of sound. They have to figure out what a word is, and then they work towards attaching meaning. And they also start to attach meaning not just to the specific words, but for the fact that when people talk to them, they often are asking them to do something, and that's following simple commands like come here, say bye-bye, or sit down. So they start to realize that not only are they interested in finding out the meaning of words, but that sometimes those words that people say are important for them to listen to so that they can respond to the person. So during that first 12 months, they're exploring a lot of the sounds and the meaning of what they hear and what is represented. Now in talking, because they've explored sound, obviously in talking, once they've explored sound and have heard sound and have represented sound in their head, they're going to start to try to make sound. And initially they coo and make sounds, they look at you and make sounds, and you make sounds to them. And then they go through a stage called babbling, where they realize that making those sounds are really fun. And you'll hear your baby in the crib, ba ba la da da ba da da da, and they're doing it not to communicate, but they're doing it because when you make those sounds, it really tickles and feels funny, and it's enjoyable to the child. So a child takes that information that they have about sound, and they begin to play with sound. They babble so that they can learn to make the motor movements that they will need for the sounds that they're later going to need to produce words, and to play with sound. They also, once they have that understanding that there are certain words that they hear in reference to a person, like every time this person comes and hugs me, they say, "Mama." Well, they start to realize that that mama is representing that person who makes me feel so good. You know, she feeds me, or daddy cuddles me, and those words. So the first words that we generally hear from children are mama and dada. And generally, we don't classify those as their first real words. It's because often it's by chance that they get that. Meaning a child will be babbling and saying, "Ma, ma, 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 ma," and mom gets so excited, "She said mama!" And the parent's reaction is so exciting that the child says, "Whoa, that must be something good to say," and begins to say that again and again because of this wonderful reaction. And every time the child says dada, you know, all this great stuff happens. So in fact, those first mama and dada, generally we don't classify as real words because it's kind of a fluke. But a good fluke because it makes us feel so good when they actually say those words. And then later they develop a meaning. Mama does, dada as a word does, by generally 12 to 14 months, does actually become a word. When you say dada, you're referring to a person. However, mama, on the other hand, doesn't really become a word. Mama, for well, at least in situations where the primary caretaker is the mother. Not so when the dada is the primary caretaker. Mama means generally help, feed me. It is a word that the child uses to get help. I have a teenager, so sometimes I wonder if mama ever becomes a person. But generally, as a child develops more and more words, mama does become a word. But initially, it is a word that children develop to get help. They need comfort, they need food, they need attention, and mama becomes that word, where dada actually does become a word before mama does. Once children have played with sound and have gotten this wonderful reaction when they've made certain sounds in certain situations, they actually start to take the sounds that they hear related to objects and start to say them. And those are children's first words. And generally we like to see children saying their first words by 12 months of age. We see children representing categories of meaning as early as 8 months of age, but it is between that 8-month time and 12 months that a child actually will say a word. And again, the earlier words tend to be more social words like hi and bye, or objects that the child really likes. My favorite story is, here I am, a specialist in language. And when I had my son, I said mama a million times a day. And my son's first word were coquette, for our cat. I was devastated. I'd worked so hard. But again, for my son, the coquette, he just loved animals, and to this day loved animals, and so it made sense that his first word wasn't mama, but it was referring to our cat. So within that first 12 months, children need to learn to tune into sound. They need to look for words and begin to develop the meaning of those words. And then by 12 months, they tend to get to the point where they are actually saying a word. Now, there are some things that parents can do to help children in this first 12 months. The first thing is to read and talk to your child from the time that they're born, all the time. Because you don't need to teach them, as I said, but it is your talking from which they are making the decisions about what words are, what sounds are, and what they want to represent. They make the decisions themselves as to what they're going to represent, but you're the person who gives them the words that they can hear to make those decisions. So the talking with your child is critical from birth. Reading with your child is also critical. It's critical both for developing communication, but also for later reading or literacy development that a child will get in school. And interesting that one of the things that we have found with when you read to your child, and initially in those first few months, it doesn't matter what you read. Once a child tunes into pictures, they are more interested. But in the earlier stage of development, they're more interested in your voice, remember. So they listen to the pattern of a sentence when you read a story. That's easier to figure out than when somebody's talking, because we drop our voices at every period when we read. We use a much more patterned type of communication. So reading to your child at 2 months of age helps your child not only develop what the concept of a sentence is, but also later when they go to read, helps them learn that love of reading. And that's only one example. They pick up the pitch of your voice, the variation in your voice from the reading that you do. And so the talking is important to help your child share this whole world with them and help them learn to represent the words that represent that world. As they're trying to get in touch with the world, you need to talk with them and also listen to them. One of the important things, of course, is turn-taking, where you don't want to just be talking to your kid all day long, like what I'm doing with you right now. You don't want to do with your child. Talking with your child from birth, we do turn-taking with children from within the first few weeks, but we don't do it verbally, with eye contact with infants, where you'll look at your child will look at you, and then they'll look away, or you'll look away. And children learn that turn-taking from birth. So when I say talk with your child all the time, it's not talk at your child, it's talking with your child. And the difference is when you talk with your child, you say something, then you wait for your child to respond to you. The response may be them looking at you, the response may be a sound, it may be a burp. Well, that's wonderful. Respond as if they responded to you. They took their turn in that conversation, and then it's your turn. And the more that you work with children in this turn-taking of back and forth, it has two very positive effects. Number one, within that first year, they're learning the conversational skills that they will need as an adult in that listening to people and responding. But number two, they also get a chance to practice. And learning motoric production, at least the talking component of learning, children need practice, just like they need practice to walk or they need practice for everything else they're going to do. The more a child talks, the more a child makes sounds, the more a child plays with sounds, the easier it's going to be for that child to learn to talk. So before, when I was talking about the importance of talking with play, if your child's the child who is really interested in the play and not doing too much talking about it, you need to work to bring talk into that play without interrupting. For example, every time when the child picks up the car, saying car or broom, so that you're bringing the talk into the play where the child realizes, well, they can talk as they are playing. It's not an either-or kind of thing. And so that you can model that talking. So you have talking in conversation where you're going to take turns. Sometimes the child's turn will be what they're doing, the play that they're doing. So you will need to read and talk with your child from the beginning. You also want to talk about what you are doing and what your child is doing. You want to name the objects. Children tend to get object words first and later tune into action words, because objects don't change as much as action words. Like, I mean, if it's a ball, it's a ball. We have different kinds, but it's still a ball. Where throwing can be very different. And it's hard to figure out, well, when does throwing start and when does throwing end, where ball is a little bit easier for children to figure out. So they tend to focus in on the object first. So you want to name the object that you're working with, because, as I said, this time of life, children are tuning into what's important in the life. What should they focus in on? And if you are naming things, you're saying to the child, this is important. If you're busy doing things, yes, they're watching you, and they're going to be able to do what you're doing because they're taking it all in. But if there aren't any words attached to it, they may take that experience in, but not have the words to attach to that experience. So the talking about what you are doing and what the child is doing is very critical during this first year, and continues to be critical throughout the first 3 years. Now, the way that you talk with the child can be very important. For example, saying one word. Children hear this stream of communication. They've got to figure out where the word starts and ends. Sometimes when you hear adults talk, that's pretty hard. So if you pause before words, or just say one word to the child as they're picking up that object ball, it makes it clearer for them that, okay, that's it. That thing that she said is what I'm holding in my hand, and it makes it a little easier for them to begin to represent the word. Children need to hear the word said a lot. For example, in the study that I did with 24-months-old, children only had to hear a word 3 times in order to represent it, meaning they understood the word after hearing it 3 times. Yet none of those children could produce a word after hearing it just 3 times. So the issue is you want to take the opportunity to produce the word a lot. Now, this is especially critical if a child has fluctuating fluid, because it's harder for that child to get that sound into their head. So you want to repeat the word a lot. Now, obviously, you don't want to say ball, 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 ball. But with children, they love to do things over and over again. So as they do it over and over again, you have the opportunity to say the word over and over again. And the more that you say it, the greater the chance that the child is going to be able to represent that word, not only for understanding, but the sounds of that word, so that the child will be able to produce it. Another critical thing that you can do as a parent, and this is often hard to do, and that is to follow the child's lead. As parents, we want to do everything we can for our children. So we tend to want to teach them. And when we teach, we lead. You know, we're pointing everything out, and we're showing everything to the child. However, what we have found in research is that when a parent is more responsive, meaning you talk about what the child is doing, the child is more apt to represent that information and to talk about it. So that, yes, it's critical to point things out to your child, but also step back and listen, watch your child, where in fact you can then, the things that you say are going to be more apt to be what the child is looking for. And in fact, research has proven that a child is more apt to represent a word for production if it's something that they're looking for. Meaning if they are, for example, children go through that what's that stage I'll talk about. Well, that's because they want that word, and they're more apt to represent that word if it's something that they're interested in. Now, let's look at the next stage of development. The next stage of communication development occurs between 12 and 24 months. Now, generally, children tend to walk anywhere between 10 and 14 months. And during that time, we get almost no communication development, because children tend to do one thing at a time. And when they're learning to walk, nothing's going to get in their way. And it is that same force and enthusiasm that they do walking or they stand up, and that single focusedness, that's not really a word, but their ability to focus singly on something helps them learn to achieve what the tremendous feats that they have to do as a young child, like learning to walk. So during the time that a child's beginning to walk, you're not going to get very much communication development. But once the child is walking, it opens up a whole new world to the child. The child sees more and can explore more than as an infant who is lying down or sitting up or crawling. So this period of time between 12 and 24 months is a time of great exploration, and also for the child to now represent those experiences to talk about them, to communicate about them. Previously, they're just kind of taking it all in, almost like a video camera, where you take the picture and you're not quite sure where it is. Well, they take this picture, and at this point in time, they now have this organization of categorization, where when they take something in, they organize it where they can get at it. So this period of time is representing the world so that they can talk about it, and so that they can learn more later without having to experience it. For example, a baby will only respond to what's in front of them. But by around 24 months of age, if you take something away from a child that they want, they don't forget it. It's called object permanence, means they know it still exists even if they can't see it. And if they want it, they still want it, which is why we get, of course, to the terrible twos, but I won't talk about that just yet. But it is that interest in exploring the world and representing the world that happens in this period of time between 12 and 24 months. Now let's take a look at a video clip of a little girl, Caitlin, during this period of time to again get something to think about as we're talking about the development that comes in.
Dog.
Dog. Dog.
Dog.
Dog.
Dog.
Dog. Dog. Dog. Woof woof. Dog. Woof woof. Dog. Oh, dog ride. Right. Whoop, dog. Whoa.
Okay, let's look at the listening development that goes on in that period between 12 and 24 months of age. Children develop an understanding of a range of words. Previous to this, in the child's developing words, they'll get one word that will represent a whole range of meaning. For example, the word car. Now, a child will use the word car to represent a whole lot of things, some of which we would call cars, some of which we wouldn't. For example, they'll use car for truck. They may use car for a wagon. They may call the lawnmower car. Anything that has wheels and go may be called car. That word car truly is not representing just one car, but that whole range of meaning. During this period of time from 12 to 24 months, children become aware of a much wider range of words, and as I said, they begin to group words. So they'll begin to look at words like car and truck and motorcycle and lawnmower and see that, yeah, in some ways they're all vehicles, but they are different, and look for what makes those things different. That, in fact, what I call a car, Mom calls a van. Okay, now what's the difference between a car and a van? Or what's the difference between a car and a bus? And they start to look for these differences. And so when they look at words, they're looking at a range of meaning for words, not just an individual word. So again, they now expand the words because they can explore more. They're interested in things like the parts of their body. They're interested in action words now, because not only are they interested in just naming what things are, but they're beginning to look at the relationship that things do things. It's a car because it goes fast, and we get in it, and we go places in it. That's what carness is all about, so they start to expand their range of meanings of words. They also do, as I said, they start to associate words into categories. So all the stuff that you eat goes in one category, and all of the things that you put on your body goes in another category, and All the stuff that you push and go goes in another category. So they start to associate new things that they learn by categories. So when they see an animal, they think of it as an animal. And then they just, if you call it a horse, well, then they have to decide, well, what's different between a horse and a dog? And they will say, well, you ride it, and if I get on my dog, he either bites me or somebody yells at me. So again, that becomes important in deciding, well, a horse is kind of like a dog, but different. So this is that association that they begin to develop of looking, and it's very critical that they develop this during this period of time, because this helps us later to access information. We look for, when we're looking for a word, well, we zip and say, okay, we've got to look for animals, and then zip down to get into, well, is it a farm animal, a zoo animal? So we start to expand those categories. That happens later, but during this time between 12 and 24 months, children begin to make all these associations so that they can learn millions of words later through this organization that they develop. And again, they start to follow more complex kinds of directions, where it's not just sit here or come down, as, you know, do you want something to drink? Where they need to listen, come on, we're going to go get the car, we're going out to McDonald's. You know, it's amazing how children might learn McDonald's, Barney, because they make connections to where they're going, or ice cream. So they make these associations, and so that they respond to more complex language. Now in talking, we see a huge change in talking in the 12 to 24 month period, generally closer to the 24 months, and that is in the production of words. Generally between 12 and 18 months, a child may get only 10 to 20 words. Remember, it's still pretty difficult. They've got some sounds, and we'll talk about the sound development a little bit later, but they'll just get 10 to 20 words. But by the time they're 24 months old, they have what we call a vocabulary spurt, where after they have figured out how to organize all these words, all of a sudden, by 24 months, we look at them producing 100 words, where they may get 1 or 2 words a month between 12 and 14 or 16 months. Between 22 and 24 months, they may get 10 words in a day. So once it's in this period of time, towards the end of this period of time, that they really have got this idea of how to organize these words and also how to produce them. And they focus in on producing a very large number of words. They also tend to do, just before they get into producing all these words, they tend to go into the what's that stage. What at? They may not say it very clearly, but they make their message very clear. I need to know the name of that thing. So it's a period of time where you as a parent, most important thing you can do is name everything. I know it drives you crazy, but everything that you put in is well worthwhile, because the child is now, before I said, you know, you really have to tune into what your child's looking at, follow your child's lead, because you don't know what they're looking at. Well, at this stage, they're making it pretty clear what they want to know and the words that they need to have to talk about things. So that's where the what's that stage comes in. And during the end of this period of time, generally between 18 and 24 months, children also start to look at the relationship between objects and actions and people. For example, my or mine possession. Mine tends to come in earlier with children who have siblings, of course, because it becomes important not to just say ball, because the ball could be your ball or my ball. And children start to use possession, so they would say my ball to indicate that, or the ball go, or hi dad, where they're starting to put 2 words together. Just beginning in the 18 to 24 month period of time, but during this time, as they get, their whole focus is getting all these words in, and it is the next stage that they tend to want to start putting them together more. In the stage between 24 months and 36 months of age, I talk about that the focus becomes using sentences to talk about the world. So we've gone from just kind of tuning into the world in the birth to 24 months to getting the words about the world in 12 to 24 months to now using sentences to describe everything that they're involved in. And their focus at this stage is in the relationship among everything. Remember, they've built this categorization and ability to associate, and now they need to expand that into the relationship of all of the objects and all of the things that we do, and how do we talk about that? And we talk about that in sentences. So they look at that relationship between the objects, the people, and the action. And not in that order. Generally, it's the people, the action, and the object. Mommy hit ball, or baby hit ball. So they start to look at that relationship during this period of time between 24 and 36 months of age. Let's look at a video clip here of a little girl named Jillian and get a sense of this age group before we talk about what communication develops here.
Put the block on top.
I playing hot.
Yeah, on top.
Oh,
Oh, crash down. Came down. Ah, maybe we try two. One like that. See, try two. And two. Block. I'll put one on.
okay, eat.
And try these.
Okay, first let's look at listening during this period of time between 24 and 36 months of age. Generally, by this point in time, children can understand sequences of communication of up to 2 to 3 sentences. So you can tell your child, go upstairs, get your coat, and give it to Daddy. By 36 months of age, it all happens over this period of time. Children also start to listen to adults' conversations. Earlier than this, they only focus in on specific words or specific sentences, but now they're aware of that conversation, and they're going to become interested in talking in conversations. If you're going to talk about the relationship of what people do, that's a conversation. So they really start to listen to conversations among adults. They also tune into the listening to the relationship among words in the sentences that we say. Now again, just beginning at this point in time, but if you say, put the ball in the box, that in becomes very important in deciding where the ball is going in relationship to the box, or put it on top of the table versus under the table. So children tend to tune into things like prepositions, where things go. Those words become important. Size words, big and little. Well, do I want the big truck or the little truck? Sometimes color, towards the end, like in the 30 to 33 month range, children will start to tune into color. That I just don't want the truck, I want the red truck. Or I want the red crayon as children begin to get into scribbling and drawing pictures. Or I want to wear the red shirt. And again, color becomes a word that they need to be aware of because they're beginning to want to be more independent and telling you what they want. That it's not that shirt that they want, it's that shirt. And they want to be more specific in how to say which shirt they want, that they develop these the components of sentences that during this period of time, and they start to tune into when we say them. Before we would say red shirt, but generally the child would just block out the red because it really wasn't important in deciding about the shirt. But as children get older, it becomes important, so they tend to listen to that relational information. Now in talking, remember, children have this huge spurt of words. So they have all these words, and now that they're interested in talking about the relational information, they began to put those words together more in 2, 3, and 4 word sentences or 5 word sentences. Generally by 3, we like to see them using at least 4 word sentences. And again, it doesn't happen like your child first uses single words and then uses 2 words and then uses 3 words. It doesn't happen that way. Again, everything in communication kind of emerges over a period of time. This whole process is very complicated and very complex. And the fact that a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old can put it all together is mind-boggling. But they do it through seeing things as a pattern. So a child will begin using all single words, and then they'll get a few 2-word sentences. And then they'll get a few 3-word sentences, and they'll use mostly 1 and 2. And then they'll get more 2 and 3-word sentences, and they may try a 4-word sentence. So as you see, there's this overlapping pattern. And again, we look at, in looking at whether a child's having difficulty or not, the range of their sentence length, meaning what's the longest sentence that your child's able to say, and what's their typical pattern. Now, a child may be able to say a 5-word sentence, but if they always choose to say 1 word at a time, then that might be indicating that they're having some difficulty putting those words together to form that sentence. During this course of time, children also focus in on conversation. Remember, they were tuning in to what we were talking about. Now they want to converse. They'll start to tell you about things that happened in the past. Like when they go out with mom or dad or grandma. Well, they'll come back in and they'll tell you. This is the time that you might begin getting things like tattling, where a child will be playing with its sibling, and all of a sudden they're coming in and telling you what happened. Again, in a very simple form, but they're beginning to do that. You're beginning to see that you can have a conversation with your child. It's not just naming things. It's talking about things where you say something and the child responds, and then you respond to them. And again, this turn-taking is very critical of always giving your child the chance to say something and then responding to what your child says, either giving new information or clarifying what they said, which is what we do in conversation. So during this period of time, again, you want to continue responding to your child, expanding their communication, both in expanding meaning, where if they say bird, say, oh yeah, there's a yellow bird, or the bird's singing. So you want to give them that further information in your response to them. Again, one of the things to be careful is asking a lot of questions. Sometimes when children are demonstrating difficulty communicating, a parent will start asking them a lot of questions, because with adults, if you want them to say something, you ask them a question. However, in children, it has the opposite effect, because if you ask them a question, like if you say, what is that? I mean, the only correct response is naming the object. And if the child doesn't have the word or can't get at the word at the time, they really can't respond to you. So it's always better to make a comment, like dog, and you can use a rising intonation as we do with a question. Then the child can say lots of things. The child can repeat you. Some children might spontaneously imitate, some may not. It's not important. If that strategy works for the child in helping them to communicate, that's great. If it doesn't work, well, then they don't need to repeat. Or they can give new information. They could say outside, that they saw the dog outside. So by giving a comment versus a question in this conversational time, you give the child further opportunities to say something. And that, of course, will help them continue that taking their turn and you're taking your turn. So asking questions is probably one of the most limiting things that you want to do in communicating with a child. Making a comment is much more helpful in helping them communicate. And giving them new information at this stage is the most critical part. acknowledging what they're saying. And of course, what happens often with children sometimes is you can't always understand everything that they say, because as I will talk in a few minutes about sound development, they don't have a whole lot of sounds that they can use at this early time. So trying to listen to one word, if you can get one word, comment about that word, and the child will either say, no, that wasn't it, or they'll get the idea that, yeah, you were listening, and this is what you got, but they'll give you more information, which again helps them learn that art of conversation. If your point isn't clear, you need to clear it up. Repeating it may be one way, but sometimes giving more information is even a little bit better. And that's specifically important for a child to learn that, you know, they need to communicate. Sometimes it's important just to take the responsibility. If a child is having difficulty with sounds, just say, I wasn't listening very well. Can you tell Mommy that again, or show me? Where, in fact, the child will know that you want to hear them, you want to respond to them, and that, you know, maybe you were busy at the time, even if you were listening. And again, you can have them show you where you can help them to communicate what they need to for you. If you didn't get it the first time, giving them other means. And again, remember, words aren't the only thing we use to communicate. We use gestures. We show people things. We talk about things in many different ways. So the more flexibility you allow a child in communicating with them, the greater the chance that you're going to engage in that wonderful time of exchanging not only information, but what their needs are, what they think about, what they feel as they get a little bit older. Developing that interaction, that sharing, that communication is sharing my life with your life, your child's life with other children's life. It's all part of that. And communication, we communicate, and especially young children. Young children communicate because they have the want to communicate or the need to communicate. If they don't have that need, for example, if you're giving them everything they want and they don't have to ask for it, they may not develop communication as easily. So you always want to set up the situation where a child will have the need to communicate to you and then respond to them in the best way that you can. Now, talking during this period of time from birth to 3 is very dependent upon the child's ability to produce sounds and words. And I'm going to talk about this development of sound because it becomes important in understanding the whole development of communication, and also for you as a parent getting a sense of how another way that you can help your child develop communication. Now, the development of sound for production takes a much longer period of time than language. The rules of language, as I said, children get generally by 3 years of age. But because a child, just like walking and climbing, which are gross motor skills, children have to have the change in their nervous system in order to be able to do those things. The mouth area, the change in the nervous system, what we call the myelination of the nerves so that they can function better, happens over a period from birth to 7 years of age, so that limits what a child can do relative to production of sound, because it depends upon what this motor development is like. So again, you can't force a child to walk. You can't force them to make sounds or help them to make sounds that they're not ready to make. So knowing how sound develops becomes very important, because again, it's you making the decision, okay, how can I make this easier for the child and go with their developing system. So generally it takes between birth to 7 years of age for them to develop all the sounds that they'll need in the English language. The earlier sounds that children develop are the easier sounds, the ones that are easier to produce. And again, it's all related to their motor abilities, so that they tend to produce sounds that are easier first and sounds that are harder, like the B sound. To make a B sound, you just close your lips and blow the air out. That's an easier sound to make, whereas a sound like the S sound, the S sound, requires a finer movement of your tongue and getting the airflow just to come across and holding your teeth a certain way, and you can make the S with your tongue up or the S with your tongue down. That requires very fine motor movement, so that generally is a sound that takes much longer time. A child may get it in one word context, but generally to stabilize where they produce it correctly, that sound is one of the ones that generally take till up to 7 years of age to get in all the words. Now, how a child develops sound, again, is from a word approach. They don't learn the B sound by itself. They learn the B sound in a word. So they learn a word that has a certain sound structure. Remember when I talked about babbling? They play with all those sounds in babbling. And children also do jargon where it sounds like they're talking to you, but there aren't any words that you happen to recognize. That's all playing with sound. That's all just making the sounds that you're going to need for words. But when it comes to producing a word, children tend to pick the easier sounds first, the ones that they can produce. And they'll learn it within one word. And then they'll learn a couple of other words that have that sound. And from that is what they then go and represent the B sound. And again, that takes a period of time. Now, let's take a look at a chart that gives you some information about how children develop sound. And again, that pattern of development, so that you can have an understanding of that earlier development that a child will have. Now, generally, the first sounds that a child develops in words generally are the M, the B, and the D. The M comes in because of mama. The D, which is a harder sound, comes in because of dada. And the B comes in because it's pretty easy to make. So those sounds tend to be in the first words that children will produce. They'll produce words that generally tend to have the M, B, or the D sound. Now again, from the first words that they produce, generally by 2 years of age, the M and the B become fully integrated. And when I talk about fully integrated, it means that any word that a child hears that has that sound in it, they will have that sound represented up here and they will produce it correctly. So there's a period of time from birth to 2 years of age that it takes for the child to kind of figure out where to get that B sound and how to get it correctly in all positions in words, not only at the beginning, but at the end, but also in the middle. The next set of sounds that tend to emerge are, again, the sounds that are easier to produce, but are a little harder to figure out. And that has to do with the P sound, the P, like in pop, the N sound, the N, like in the famous word no. And I truly believe that the reason that that sound comes in earlier, because the other sounds that are produced like that, like the T and the D where the tongue tip comes up, comes in later. They take much longer to produce, but no is a very important word to most children. So by around 16 months of age, between 16 and 18 months of age, that word starts to come in. I never teach that word unless a parent gives me permission, because once you teach it, that's such a powerful word. You hear it a lot. But that N tends to come in, I think, because of that famous N-O word. The next two sounds that come in the earlier period of time are the H sound, the H sound, like in high, or the W sound, like in water, or wow, or we. Those sounds, again, the H is very easy. You just blow out air, but it's harder for a child to hear where that sound appears. So that one comes in a little later, and the W requires lip rounding. And again, that's not difficult, but it requires a little more movement than the closing of the lips for the PB and the M sound. So generally, over this period of time, we get the M and B first, then the P, the H, the N, and the W come in. So generally, by 3 years of age, those sounds are stable, meaning they're produced consistently in all words that a child would attempt to say. Now, there's another set of sounds that begin to emerge at around 2 in some children, but some children not close to 30 months to 33 months. But I'll talk about them anywhere. And those are the sounds that now require the tongue to move back. The k sound, the k sound, the g sound. They tend to require the child to be able to pull their tongue back. Those sounds are harder, so they begin to emerge around 2 years of age, but they don't stabilize till about 4 years of age. And another sound that comes in around the 2 stages, the t sound, the t. And again, that doesn't stabilize till 4. Now, by 3 years of age, in the 3 to 4 year period of time, the f sound and the y sound begin to emerge. They are a little bit more difficult to say, and again, they come in around 3 and generally stabilize by 4. All of the other sounds in the English language, the L, the L, the S, the sh sound, the j sound, all of those sounds tend to come in later. You may see them in some words as early as 2.5 to 3 years of age, but generally, because they're harder to say, they tend to emerge much later. And those are the sounds that tend not to stabilize till a child is 5, 6, or 7 years of age. So in this earlier time, if you want to help your child, it's important to try to choose words that have sounds that the child could produce. For example, if a car crashes, you could say crash, but considering the k and the sh are not even on the chart at this point in time, that it's highly unlikely that the child is going to say that word. Where if you said boom, where in fact the B and the M are both there, pretty easy to say, you can in fact increase the chance that the child may be able to say something, and they may be able to say that word, boom, and use that word. So clearly picking the words that have the sounds that a child is able to say at this period of time is very helpful for the child. Now, the other thing that's different than that is if there's a word that a child really, really, really wants to say, then in fact they will pick up the sounds in that word and be able to approximate that word. So again, the most important thing is finding the word that the child really wants to say. The second component is picking words that have sounds that the child is motorically able to produce. Now again, often what happens in this period of time is the child has limited motor ability and they only have a certain capacity that they can use to produce speech. So often as they start to expand the length of the sentence that they produce, they'll start to drop out sounds. And it's not that they still have them represented in their head, it's just that their tongue only works so fast and there's only so much that their tongue can do at 2 or 3 years of age. So some sounds tend to drop out. Those sounds, what you would want to do in that situation is just repeat what the child says and just target in on that sound to remind them that, they have to get that sound in there or you may not understand. So as the child develops longer sentences, sometimes it's harder to understand them. And the 2 strategies that you can use is either back them up, meaning simplify their sentence if they start to lose sounds when they're producing a 4-word sentence, bring them back to a 3-word sentence, meaning you repeat a 3-word sentence in response to them to let them know that you understood what they said, but it's clearer if they say it this way. You can adjust your communication depending upon the clarity. Obviously, the clarity of what they say to you is critical because you need to be able to understand what your child is saying to you in order for your child to feel good about talking, because it is that sharing that becomes so important to the child. Now, as we've looked at normal development, we've looked at some of the health issues that affect development, it's important for you as a parent to think about, do you feel your child's doing just fine? Or do you feel that your child may be having some difficulty in communication? If the child's having some difficulty in communication, there are some children who just tend to develop communication a little bit later than others. And again, remember, I said this is big normal range. So you don't want to worry about it, but you do want to get information. And the important thing is to get information for someone like myself as a professional to be able to say to you, yeah, this child is developing communication normally. They're just developing it a little bit slower than maybe your other child did or other children, the children down the street. But that's still normal for your child. Or for me to say, well, it seems like your child may be having a little bit of difficulty getting the sounds or getting the words, where it would be critical for you to do something different in the way that you're talking with the child to see if you can help them get those sounds. If the child is having difficulty, as I said before, and I can't highlight this enough, if the child is having any difficulty, the earlier that we begin to try to help them, the better it is for the child, for their present development of communication and all of their future learning. Always, if you have any concerns, you should talk to your doctor. Your doctor knows your child. They have generally followed your child from birth. They know you. You generally feel comfortable talking with them. But again, your doctor is not a specialist in language or communication. They have some information, and I do workshops and in-service training with physicians to help them try to keep up on all the things that are the new information that we have about how communication develops. But they know the whole child. It's important that either that they refer the child to a speech and language pathologist who is a specialist in the communication component, or to just have you get some further information. One of the things that I have researched, as I've done research in the last 15 to 20 years about how children develop communication and what parents can do to make it easier for them, I developed a program which includes a telephone screening, and I've researched it, and it is very effective, where a parent can call up and I can ask them some questions about their child's communication development and give them an idea of whether it sounds like their child's within that normal range or whether their child may be having some difficulties. Often I'll give you suggestions about, well, try this, this, and this, and then see how that works. If that works, maybe that's all that you need to, for that child. Or maybe the child needs to be evaluated, where we'll get more information than just to ask a few questions on the phone, where we can then give you more specific things or stimulate the child in a different way. To find out, every child can learn to communicate. It's finding out what works for that child. There isn't any right or wrong in communication. As a parent, it's finding out what works best for that child. So the telephone screening is another option where you can call in, get some information, get some ideas of how to try to stimulate the child, and then see, look, does the child respond to those things? Well, if they respond, maybe that's all that's needed. If they don't respond, maybe we need to do an evaluation. Maybe they need to be involved in working with a speech and language pathologist to help develop these skills, to work with the family to explore what's the best way for this child to learn to communicate. If you have any questions or are interested in doing a screening, at the end of this program there will be a telephone number that you can call to reach me, where you can ask for just a question, or if you want to do a telephone screening. If you are viewing this program in another area, we will have a number on the screen for a speech and language pathologist in your area, or you can call the station and get that information. The American Speech and Hearing Association also has a consumer line that if you call, we can give you that information for someone in your area. The most important thing in looking at communication development in young children is that it's a very exciting, thrilling time for you as parents and for the child. And that just because the child may be having a little bit of difficulty now doesn't mean that your child's not very bright. Children who are very bright, who are very creative, who have a lot of potential as learners may still have a little difficulty in learning to communicate. There's a whole range of learning in young children. Communication is one part of it, but it also is a critical part. So I hope this program has given you some information, important information about how children develop communication, so that you can look at your own child and explore some ways of trying to help your child develop that exciting power of communication. Thank you.